Today is May 6th, 2026, and something happened in the waters of the northern Philippines this morning that Xi Jinping has been telling himself would never happen. Not the Iranian missile claim about the Abraham Lincoln, not the Saudi triple bypass announcement, not the Trump Truth Social post about bombing at higher intensity. Something that strikes at the foundational strategic calculation that the entire Chinese Communist Party's regional ambition has been built on for decades. Japan fired an offensive missile overseas for the first time since World War II. Read that sentence and hold it for a moment before you accept how significant it is. 80 years. 8 decades of pacifist doctrine embedded in Japan's post-war constitutional identity, its political culture, its diplomatic relationships, its national self-understanding as a country that had renounced offensive military action after the catastrophic consequences of the last time it exercised that capacity. 80 years. And today, from the shores of Pauai in the Ilocos Norte province of the northern Philippines, facing the South China Sea, Japan launched 2 Type 88 anti-ship cruise missiles that reached a decommissioned Philippine Navy ship 75 kilometers offshore in 6 minutes and destroyed it completely. Xi Jinping built his entire strategic architecture for Taiwan and the South China Sea on the assumption that Japan would not move. Japan moved, and the missile that Japan fired today is not just a weapons demonstration. It is the sound of the foundational assumption underneath the CCP's regional ambitions collapsing in real time. The question now is not whether the calculation is broken. The question is how quickly Beijing realizes it is broken and what it decides to do about a strategic situation that just became significantly more complicated than it was 24 hours ago. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand why Japan firing 2 missiles in the South China Sea during a multilateral exercise changes the strategic geometry of the entire Pacific theater in ways that the individual missile statistics cannot capture, you need to understand the specific calculation Xi Jinping built China's regional strategy around, why that calculation had been reliable for decades, and what specifically about Japan's participation in Balikatan 2026 on May 6, 2026, broke it in a way that no previous American naval deployment, no previous Philippine legal challenge, and no previous Allied diplomatic statement had managed to break. Here's where we stand as of May 6, 2026. In the waters of the northern Philippines, as part of the Balikatan 2026 exercise, Japan's self-defense forces conducted a maritime strike operation that represented the first time Japan has fired offensive missiles overseas since World War II. The specific weapon was the Type 88 SSM-1, a truck-mounted land-based anti-ship cruise missile with an operational range of approximately 180 to 200 kilometers. 2 missiles were fired 2 minutes apart from the shores of Pauai in Ilocos Norte. They flew at low altitude over the sea surface, guided by radar toward the decommissioned Philippine Navy ship BRP Quezon, anchored 75 kilometers offshore. The transit from launch to target impact took 6 minutes. The target was destroyed. The following day, the exercise continued with a second decommissioned vessel, the BRP Magsaysay. But the individual missiles and the individual target ships are not the story. The story is the coordinated strike architecture that surrounded Japan's launch. The United States had deployed HIMARS rocket systems and NMESIS anti-ship missile systems at strategic launch points simultaneously. A Boeing P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol and reconnaissance aircraft provided target acquisition and tracking for the entire strike package. The Philippines committed FA-50 fighters, Super Tucano light attack aircraft, and 2 frigates. Canada sent a Halifax-class frigate. Naval, air, and ground forces from 4 separate countries synchronized their attacks with split-second precision and simultaneously struck the same target from multiple platforms and multiple domains. This was not a test of a weapon. This was a test of a kill web. The question being answered at Balikatan 2026 was not whether Japan's Type 88 can hit a ship. It clearly can. The question being answered was whether the US, Japan, the Philippines, Canada, and their partners can operate as a unified integrated strike architecture in the South China Sea simultaneously. And the answer was demonstrated in 6 minutes of flight time between a Pauai launch pad and a sinking Philippine ship. Now let me give you the specific strategic calculation that Balikatan 2026 broke, because Xi Jinping's regional ambitions have a specific logical structure and understanding that structure is the only way to understand why China's foreign ministry spokesperson described Japan's missile firing as playing with fire in language that carried what analysis of Chinese diplomatic communications identifies as genuine strategic panic, rather than routine condemnation. Xi Jinping's regional strategy rests on a sequence of 2 acquisitions. First, dominance in the South China Sea through the continued expansion and militarization of artificial islands and the enforcement of Chinese maritime claims over disputed reefs from Scarborough Shoal to the Spratly Islands. Second, Taiwan. These 2 objectives are related. South China Sea dominance provides the operational environment in which a Taiwan blockade or invasion becomes militarily executable by denying the United States and its allies the geographic positions, the transit routes, and the forward deployment opportunities necessary to project sufficient force to defeat a Chinese military operation against the island. Beijing's ability to sequence toward both objectives has depended since the late 1990s on one foundational assumption being reliably true: that Japan, which dominated the entire Pacific region through military force in the first half of the 20th century, and whose strategic capacity in the region was demonstrated by its ability to reach Pearl Harbor in December 1941, had buried itself so completely in its post-war pacifist identity that it would never again take active military action in the region. This assumption was not unreasonable. Japan's post-war constitution contains a renunciation of war as a sovereign right and prohibits the maintenance of war potential. For 7 decades, that constitutional constraint, combined with the political culture it produced, made Japan a reliable non-actor in the security architecture of the South China Sea and the Western Pacific beyond its own immediate territorial waters. Xi Jinping took that reliability and built his entire regional strategic timeline on top of it. As long as Japan does not move, reaching Taiwan and the reefs is only a matter of time. Japan moved. Let me now give you the specific geographic dimension of where Japan fired its missiles, because the location of the launch is more strategically significant than the fact of the launch, and most coverage has not placed it in the geographic context that explains why Beijing's response was so specifically alarmed. The firing took place from Pauai in Ilocos Norte, the northernmost province of Luzon, the largest Philippine island. That location is positioned directly on the route where China plans to blockade Taiwan, and in the heart of the waters where it seeks to establish dominance over the disputed reefs. More specifically, Pauai faces the Luzon Strait, the passage between Taiwan and the northern Philippines that represents the most critical geographic choke point in the entire Pacific for Chinese naval operations. The Luzon Strait is where the Chinese Navy must pass to exit the South China Sea into the open Pacific. Chinese submarines, surface vessels, and any naval task force configured for a Taiwan blockade must transit the Luzon Strait or the Miyako Strait further north to reach the operational area. Anti-ship missiles with 180 to 200 kilometer range positioned at Pauai cover a significant portion of the Luzon Strait's width. Japan fired its missiles directly onto the coverage zone of one of China's most critical naval transit routes. That is not an accident of exercise geography. That is a deliberate strategic communication delivered in the most unambiguous possible format. Ordnance rather than words. And 4 days before Japan's firing, on May the 2nd, U.S. and Philippine forces had deployed the NMESIS anti-ship missile system to Batanes, the closest Philippine territory to Taiwan, positioned at the northern end of the Luzon Strait. Type 88 from the south of the strait, NMESIS from the north. A missile arc restricting Chinese naval freedom of maneuver through the most critical Pacific transit route is forming in real time. And Beijing's foreign ministry called it playing with fire, not because it is rhetorically extreme, but because Beijing understands exactly what the geography means for its Taiwan operational planning. Now, I want you to hear this specific detail very carefully, because it is the one that changes the Balikatan 2026 story from a single impressive exercise to a structural transformation of the Pacific security architecture. Philippine Defense Secretary Teodoro, who was present on site watching the Type 88 firing, made a statement that deserves the analytical attention it has not received in most coverage. He said that they saw how the Type 88 missile system works and understood that they could work with it in the future. That sentence is a public expression of intent to integrate Japan's anti-ship missile system into the Philippine military's own defense architecture. Read that carefully. The Philippines is considering deploying Japan's weapon system. If that integration proceeds, the missile arc forming around the Luzon Strait is not a bilateral US-Japan exercise artifact that disappears when Balikatan 2026 ends. It is the beginning of a permanent Allied missile architecture that positions Japanese weapons on Philippine territory facing the South China Sea. Japan is simultaneously in talks with Manila on the transfer of Abukuma-class destroyers and TC-90 patrol aircraft to the Philippine Navy. Japan is not only firing missiles in the Pacific, it is building a permanent military presence through the transfer of platforms that extend Philippine naval capability in ways that are directly relevant to the South China Sea's disputed waters. The exercise demonstrated the kill web's capability. The defense cooperation agreements being negotiated around it are making the kill web permanent. And that permanence is what China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian was actually warning about when he accused Japan of neo-militarism and said that allies are playing with fire. Not the two missiles, the trajectory they represent. Now let me give you the full picture of what the kill web architecture demonstrated at Balikatan 2026 actually means technically, because most coverage of this exercise has described it as impressive without explaining the specific military engineering it represents. The term kill web describes a concept that is more sophisticated than the older kill chain concept it is replacing. A kill chain describes a linear sequence of steps from target identification to weapon impact. A kill web describes a network of sensors, weapons, and command nodes that can each perform multiple roles and that can route information and fire authority through different paths if any single node is destroyed or degraded. The kill web demonstrated at Balikatan 2026 had the P-8A Poseidon providing target acquisition and tracking data to multiple weapon systems simultaneously. The HIMARS ground-based rocket systems receiving that data and computing firing solutions from their positions ashore. The NMESIS anti-ship missile launchers receiving the same data from a different geographic position. Japan's Type 88 systems receiving targeting information and firing from yet another geographic position. Philippine FA-50 fighters contributing organic airborne sensors to the targeting picture. And Canadian and Philippine frigates contributing naval fires from sea-based positions. Every element of this network was operating from a different position, using different sensors, and firing different weapons. The single decommissioned ship that absorbed the simultaneous impact from all of these systems is the physical demonstration of what the kill web produces. No single node in the network controls the outcome. If China attempts to suppress the kill web by destroying one of its components, the other components continue to function and the network routes around the gap. This is the A2AD counter-architecture. China's anti-access and area denial doctrine was built on the ability to make the U.S. Navy's approach to the Taiwan Strait operationally too costly by positioning anti-ship missiles, submarines, and air defense systems that could deny access to the area of operations. The kill web architecture demonstrated at Balikatan 2026 is specifically designed to puncture that A2AD bubble by distributing the Allied strike capability across so many different platforms and positions that China cannot suppress it all simultaneously. You cannot stop the kill web by destroying one node. You must destroy all nodes simultaneously. And the nodes are distributed across the Philippines, Japan, the United States, Canada, and potentially other allied nations whose equipment was present at the exercise. Now let me show you the Type 88 SSM-1 in the technical detail that explains why its specific characteristics matter for the South China Sea operational environment. The Type 88 is a truck-mounted land-based anti-ship cruise missile. The truck-mounted configuration is the characteristic that makes it specifically dangerous in the South China Sea's geographic environment. A truck-mounted missile system can relocate quickly, is difficult to detect through persistent aerial or satellite surveillance because it does not require fixed infrastructure, and can be deployed to different coastal points as the operational situation demands. The system drives to a launch position, deploys its missiles, fires, and relocates before the enemy can triangulate its position from the launch signature. In the island geography of the Philippines, with its hundreds of islands, peninsulas, and coastal positions, a truck-mounted anti-ship missile system can be virtually anywhere along a very long and complex coastline. Finding and targeting it before it relocates after each firing is an extraordinarily difficult intelligence and strike problem for a Chinese military planner. The missile itself flies at low altitude close to the sea surface, making it difficult to detect and intercept with ship-based air defense radars that have horizon limitations. With 180 to 200 kilometer range, a Type 88 system positioned anywhere on Luzon's northern coast covers a large portion of the Luzon Strait. With the Philippines considering the permanent acquisition of this system, the coverage becomes the standing capability of the Philippine military rather than the temporary presence of Japanese forces during an exercise. Now let me address the timing of Balikatan 2026 in the full strategic context that makes the exercise's timing as significant as its content. Three critical developments were unfolding simultaneously around the world while Japan was firing its first overseas offensive missiles since World War II. First, the Iran-Hormuz crisis. The United States had deployed 3 carrier strike groups to the Gulf, broken Iran's blockade through Project Freedom's fast attack boat destruction by Apache and Seahawk helicopters, and was conducting intense military operations, including the FA-18 disabling of the Iranian oil tanker Hasna. This crisis had shifted significant American military attention and resources to the Middle East, and had led many analysts in Beijing to calculate that U.S. preoccupation in the Gulf would create a strategic vacuum in the Pacific that China could exploit. Second, Turkey unveiled the Yildirim intercontinental ballistic missile with a 6,000-kilometer range at the Saha 2026 Defense Expo, signaling that long-range strike capabilities had been elevated to a new global dimension and accelerating the arms race dynamics that are reshaping every regional security calculation simultaneously. Third, Russia was scaling back its Victory Day parade preparations due to drone threats from Ukraine, canceling armored vehicle convoys in Red Square, forced to abandon even the biggest symbolic showcase of Russian military power because Ukraine's strike campaign had made the display of military hardware at a Moscow public event a security liability. Russia was demonstrating weakness at precisely the moment when its unlimited partnership with China was supposed to be demonstrating mutual strength. Beijing was probably calculating that American preoccupation with the Middle East, combined with Russian pressure on Europe distracting NATO, had created the optimal window for advancing its Pacific ambitions. Balikatan 2026 proved the opposite calculation correct. While Washington was conducting operations with 3 aircraft carriers in the Gulf simultaneously, it committed 10,000 troops to the Pacific and carried out a historic exercise in which Japan fired offensive missiles for the first time since World War II. The United States demonstrated simultaneous power projection on 2 fronts in ways that directly challenged China's distraction window theory. And the timing of Japan's missile firing at the moment when China was most confident that American attention was elsewhere is precisely what makes it most strategically disorienting for Beijing's planners. Now let me give you the economic dimension of what is at stake in the South China Sea, because the geoeconomic consequence of the kill web that Balikatan 2026 demonstrated is the dimension that most military analysis underweights relative to the combat capability discussion. The South China Sea carries between 21 and 33% of global maritime trade. Annual trade volume passing through these waters is estimated between $3.4 and $5.3 trillion. 40 to 45% of global crude oil shipments pass through this corridor. 42% of global propane, 26% of global automotive trade, the bulk of China's own energy imports, a significant portion of Japan's and South Korea's oil requirements. This is not a militarily contested body of water that happens to have economic significance on the margins. It is the most economically consequential maritime corridor on Earth outside the Strait of Hormuz, and the Iran-Hormuz crisis has already demonstrated what happens to global energy markets and global supply chains when one of the world's critical maritime corridors is destabilized. Expert models project that in a prolonged South China Sea crisis, Taiwan's economy could shrink by 33%, Singapore's by 22%, and the Philippines and Vietnam's by 10 to 15%. Japan and South Korea could suffer GDP losses of 2 to 3% each. Any blockade, conflict, or sustained gray zone tension in the South China Sea that redirects shipping to alternative routes, extends transit times by 10 to 40 days, severely affecting fuel costs, insurance premiums, and every global supply chain that depends on the delivery timelines those routes currently achieve. The kill web demonstrated at Balikatan 2026 is not just a military deterrent. It is an economic deterrent. It is the demonstration that Allied naval strike capability can defend the openness of a trade corridor that 21 to 33% of global maritime trade depends on. And the specific irony that China's own energy imports are among the flows that this corridor carries is the contradiction that restricts Beijing's room to maneuver in ways that it cannot fully acknowledge publicly without undermining its own territorial claims in the same waters. Now let me give you the Japan strategic transformation that Balikatan 2026 represents, because this is the dimension that most Pacific security analysis has been tracking since Japan's 2022 national defense strategy, and that today's missile firing makes operationally real rather than doctrinally aspirational. Japan adopted counterstrike capability expansion in its 2022 national defense strategy. This was a doctrinal departure from Japan's post-war defense-only posture that created enormous political controversy within Japan and significant strategic concern in Beijing. But adopting counterstrike capability in a strategy document and demonstrating counterstrike capability by firing offensive missiles from the territory of a treaty ally in the South China Sea are 2 different things, separated by an enormous distance of political will and operational commitment. Japan crossed that distance today. The Balikatan 2026 firing is the practical application of the 2022 strategy's counterstrike doctrine in the most operationally significant possible location. Japan can now demonstrate offensive capability beyond its own shores in coordination with its allies. That capability, once demonstrated, is available as a deterrent in ways that a doctrinal statement cannot replicate. Deterrence requires the adversary to believe the capability is real and will be used. A missile hitting a ship 75 kilometers offshore in 6 minutes in front of the Philippine Defense Secretary and the assembled forces of 4 nations is the most credible possible demonstration that the capability is real. Beijing cannot pretend it did not happen. The footage exists. The ship is sunk. The trajectory from this exercise to a genuine operational capability in a crisis scenario is shorter than any previous point in Japan's post-war history. And the U.S. integrated deterrence strategy is specifically designed to harmonize Japan's Type 88 system with American HIMARS and NMESIS assets and Philippine organic capabilities into a single networked kill web that is greater than the sum of its parts. Japan's Type 88 guidance can be cued by American P-8A Poseidon targeting data. NMESIS and HIMARS firing data can be shared with Philippine frigates. The kill web's command architecture connects sensors to shooters across national boundaries through a Link 16 equivalent system that the 4 participating nations have been practicing interoperability with. This is not 4 countries shooting at the same target. This is 4 countries operating as one distributed military system. So who is actually running China's strategic calculation right now, and what does Beijing's response tell you about how it is processing the Balikatan 2026 result? China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian's public response accused Japan of neo-militarism, stated that Japan was firing offensive missiles overseas without reflecting on its historical crimes, characterized the move as a violation of Japan's post-war defense-only policy, and warned allies that they are playing with fire. That response deserves to be analyzed as a strategic communication rather than simply a condemnation. The neo-militarism accusation is designed to mobilize the historical narrative that has been China's most reliable instrument for constraining Japan's regional military engagement. The reference to Japan's historical crimes frames any Japanese military action in the Pacific as a repetition of the conduct that produced World War II's Pacific Theater, which is the framing most likely to generate domestic political pressure within Japan against the counterstrike doctrine and most likely to complicate Japan's relationships with Southeast Asian nations that retain historical grievances from the Japanese occupation. The violation of post-war policy accusation is designed to suggest that Japan has broken an international commitment rather than made a domestic policy choice. And playing with fire is designed to signal escalation risk at a level that communicates genuine strategic concern rather than routine diplomatic disapproval. The Chinese military's operational response, deploying the Liaoning carrier group and H-6 bombers and continuing gray zone exclusion tactics at Scarborough Shoal, represents actions that remain below the threshold of direct conflict, but that signal China's presence and its claim to decision-making authority in the contested waters. But gray zone tactics and carrier group deployments do not answer the missile arc that now restricts Chinese naval transit through the Luzon Strait. They are the response of a power that has not yet decided how to respond operationally to a development that its strategic doctrine did not adequately model. Now let's bring the three-track convergence into the complete picture, because what Balikatan 2026 represents is not just a Pacific security story. It is connected to the Iran-Hormuz crisis, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and the global arms race dynamics in ways that matter for the complete strategic picture. The Iran track. The United States demonstrated in the Persian Gulf that it can simultaneously project carrier strike group-scale power into a regional conflict while maintaining its treaty commitments in the Pacific. 3 carrier groups in the Gulf and 10,000 troops at Balikatan 2026 at the same time. China's calculation that American preoccupation with Iran would create a Pacific vacuum has been empirically refuted in the most direct possible way. The Russia-Ukraine track. Russia scaling back its Victory Day parade due to Ukrainian drone threats and the Russian military's publicly acknowledged air defense degradation at the hands of Ukrainian systematic attrition represents a weakening of the China-Russia Unlimited Partnership's demonstration of combined military strength. As Russia's conventional military capacity is consumed by the Ukraine conflict and its military credibility is challenged by Ukrainian precision strike, Russia becomes a progressively less reliable partner for China's Pacific ambitions and a progressively less credible deterrent against American power projection in the region. The Pacific deterrence track. Japan's missile firing at Balikatan 2026, the NMESIS deployment to Batanes 4 days earlier, the 17,000-troop Allied exercise, and the Japan-Philippines defense cooperation discussions about destroyer and aircraft transfers together represent a rapid institutionalization of exactly the anti-China deterrence architecture that Beijing's A2AD strategy was designed to prevent from forming. The first island chain is transforming from a geographic description into an operational missile shield. All 3 tracks are converging toward a single strategic moment in which China's room to maneuver in the Pacific is being compressed from multiple directions simultaneously. Here is the honest and complete strategic assessment of what Japan's first overseas missile firing since World War II means for the regional security architecture over the next 5 years. Some analysts are assessing Balikatan 2026 as a dress rehearsal for a possible 2027 Taiwan crisis scenario. If that assessment is correct, the exercise demonstrated something specific and highly relevant to that scenario's dynamics. The Allied kill web can execute a coordinated multi-platform, multi-domain, multinational strike operation against a maritime target in the South China Sea with split-second precision. 4 countries synchronized, a single target destroyed. The operational question for a 2027 Taiwan scenario would be whether a kill web of this type, expanded to include additional allies and additional platforms, can impose sufficient operational costs on a Chinese naval force attempting a Taiwan blockade that the blockade becomes militarily unexecutable or politically unsustainable. Balikatan 2026 kill web demonstration does not answer that question definitively, but it advances the Allied capability toward an answer in ways that change China's operational planning assumptions for the Taiwan scenario in measurable and concerning ways for Beijing. The truck-mounted mobility of the Type 88 system means China cannot pre-suppress it by targeting fixed positions. The network architecture means China cannot suppress the kill web by destroying one of its nodes. The multinational nature of the exercise means China cannot respond to Japanese firing without also responding to American, Philippine, and Canadian firing from the same network, which is a significantly more complex diplomatic and military escalation decision than responding to Japan alone. Xi Jinping's window for the Taiwan scenario, if it ever existed in the form he calculated, is narrowing with each exercise that refines Allied kill web integration and with each defense cooperation agreement that institutionalizes Allied presence in the geographic positions that restrict Chinese naval freedom of maneuver through the Luzon Strait. The structural question that every analyst watching this situation should be sitting with is the one that the Philippine Defense Secretary's statement about future Type 88 integration raises most directly. Is Japan's Balikatan 2026 participation a one-time exercise event or the beginning of a sustained transformation of Japan's role in the Pacific security architecture? The answer visible in the surrounding policy landscape is the latter. Japan's 2022 National Defense Strategy explicitly adopted counterstrike capability. Japan's defense budget has been on a trajectory toward the NATO 2% of GDP guideline that would make it among the largest defense budgets in the world within a few years. Japan-Philippines defense cooperation discussions are active across multiple capability areas. Japan has been integrating into the U.S. integrated deterrence architecture with increasing speed and depth since 2022. And the domestic political constraint that pacifist doctrine imposed on Japanese military action in the Pacific has been weakening with each year that China's behavior at Scarborough Shoal, in the East China Sea near the Senkaku Islands, and in its public declarations about Taiwan provides Japanese policymakers with a concrete threat narrative that can justify the constitutional evolution that counterstrike capability requires. Today's missile firing is not the arrival of a new Japanese military policy. It is the operational demonstration of a policy transformation that has been underway for 4 years and that reached its first overseas proof point in the waters of the northern Philippines. Xi Jinping built the CCP's regional ambitions on the calculation that Japan would never move. Japan moved. It fired an offensive missile overseas for the first time in 80 years. It fired it in coordination with 4 allied nations using a kill web architecture specifically designed to puncture China's anti-access and area denial bubble in the South China Sea. It fired it at the geographic location that most directly threatens China's naval transit route through the Luzon Strait. It fired it while the United States was simultaneously running 3 carrier strike groups in the Persian Gulf, demonstrating that American simultaneous power projection on 2 fronts is operationally real rather than merely theoretical. And it fired it while Russia was scaling back its Victory Day parade because Ukrainian drones had made the display of military hardware at a Moscow public event a security liability, demonstrating that the China-Russia Unlimited Partnership's demonstration of combined military strength has limits. The first island chain is becoming an operational missile shield, 1 Type 88 launch and 1 NMESIS deployment at a time. Beijing's calculation is broken? The question that nobody can answer from the outside, and possibly from the inside either, is what Xi Jinping does when he processes the full implications of a calculation that was supposed to be reliable, having produced a result this far from what was anticipated. Does he accelerate his Taiwan timeline before the kill web becomes more capable? Does he recalibrate his ambitions toward targets where the Allied deterrence architecture is less developed? Does he test the kill web's real capability through a calibrated escalation in the South China Sea to find its actual limits? Or does he recognize that the window he was counting on has closed faster than his planning anticipated and adjust his strategic timeline accordingly? That question, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable from the current position, is the one that should be concentrating the attention of every Pacific security analyst, every Allied military planner, and every government in the region that has been conducting its own quiet assessment of what Japan's missile firing means for its strategic position in a South China Sea that just became a great deal more contested than it was 75 kilometers and 6 minutes ago. Drop your prediction in the comments. Does Japan's first overseas missile firing deter China from further South China Sea aggression? Or does it push Beijing toward a harsher response that tests the kill web's actual operational limits? Subscribe and turn on notifications. The Luzon Strait now has missiles on both ends of it. The kill web is live, and Xi Jinping's calculation that Japan would never move has just been answered by a Type 88 anti-ship missile traveling 75 kilometers in 6 minutes. We will see you in the next one.